working for a family friend doing a boundary survey a couple months ago. It's on one of our local rivers, really beautiful. It's about 10 acres of pasture land on one of our local rivers, and the property hadn't been surveyed in over 100 years, and there was no property corner monument set, so it was a tough boundary survey. But we were able to get the boundary pinned down actually better than I thought, within a foot or two. And when we did our survey, we located some of the fences. There were some questions about where the fences were at in relation to the boundary lines, and we found out there were some major fence encroachments. Encroachment is what a surveyor. That's the term we use as surveyors when there's a building or a fence or a wall or a driveway, some physical feature that crosses the property line when it shouldn't. So in this particular piece of pasture, the neighbor's north fence was about 35 feet into our client's land. And then on the south side, the client's fence was about 55 feet into the neighbor's land on the south. And so we took the results of our survey back to our client and said, we found some issues here, and you should work with us, maybe think about getting a land attorney, and we can get this cleaned up. And so one of the questions our client asked is what do I do about this? What are my options? And it was a good question. So I want to talk about that. If you've gotten a survey and your surveyor comes to you with a large fence encroachment or fence or wall. So we're not talking about buildings in this video. We're talking about fences or walls. What are your options? What can you do? Well, first, you should make sure that your surveyor has checked a few things before you do anything drastic about the fence. So I'm going to give you, 3 things that your surveyor should do. You should talk to your surveyor about these 3 things before you do anything with the neighbor. Okay. So number 1, your surveyor should make some evaluation of unwritten rights. Okay. And he can work with a lawyer to do that. Some surveyors aren't comfortable doing that, which is understandable. But you should figure out, have some unwritten rights developed. Now I will tell you, in California, it's hard for you or your neighbor to develop what we call adverse possession or squatter's rights based on the fence. And there's even some recent court decisions that have said most of the time the courts are going to make you move the fence. They're not going to give you or your neighbor property based on adverse possession because of the fence. Now it's easier to get what we call a prescriptive right or prescriptive easement, and that's the right to use land. So if you have a driveway that's over a property line, courts are more likely to give your neighbor or you the right to use that driveway on somebody else's property. But courts are getting more and more hesitant to just take property, what we call in fee, take the actual ownership of the property and give it to a neighbor based on the location of a fence. So, your surveyor and your attorney should evaluate what kind of unwritten rights may have developed. And ultimately, you have to go to court to get that sorted out. But you want to know, you want to understand what kind of ground you stand on with your neighbor. The second thing that your surveyor and the attorney should talk about is it possible that there was a boundary line agreement? Did you and your neighbor or the predecessors to you and your neighbor ever agree that the boundary line should be where the fence is? And is there any evidence of that? And it's hard to prove. Usually there isn't, but in rare cases there may be some evidence of that. There may even be a written agreement somewhere. The other thing that they should do, the third thing is, especially if you have an old fence, is you should talk about how uncertain is the location of the boundary line. Surveyors can't always locate lines with certainty, and it may be that the uncertainty in the location of the boundary line is larger than the encroachment. Well, in that case, you really don't have an encroachment. The surveyor should probably just put the boundary line where the fence is. In this particular case, the example I gave you in the beginning, I knew I had that property line within a foot or two, and we had a huge encroachment, 35 feet on the one line, 50 feet on the other. So without a doubt, there was a problem there that needed to be fixed. If I think I can't get the property line closer than a foot, I'm not going to tell the neighbor the fence is I'm not going to tell my client their neighbor's fence is a half a foot over the line. It's not. I'm probably going to put the boundary line at the fence. And in some rare cases, an old fence can be good evidence of the location of the boundary line. But there are a lot of situations where it's a newer fence and it's clear the fences, they got built without the benefit of a survey and they're in the wrong spot for whatever reason. But your surveyor should examine those 3 things, right? What kind of unwritten rights are developed? Has there been any previous boundary line agreement between the owners that moved the line to the fence? And is the surveyor sure he knows where the line's at? Is there really an encroachment based on how accurate the survey is? Okay, so let's say your surveyor and your attorney have gone through those three things and they say, nope, there's a fence encroachment and it's large. What are your options? What can you do? I'm going to give you 4 options. Okay. Here's the first one. You just leave the fence where it's at and you don't do anything. You do nothing. That's usually not a good idea. I don't like that. And the reason why there's 2 reasons. One is if your property is the one that's burdened by the encroachment, if you do nothing, your neighbor can eventually acquire unwritten rights, and you don't want that to happen. Secondly, if you are encroaching on the neighbors, that can cause a problem when you go to sell your property. It can also affect the value of your property. So you want to get that cleaned up, if at all possible. But that's one option, do nothing. Not my recommended option. Option number 2 is you ask your neighbor to move the fence, or you move your own fence if you're the encroacher. And a lot of times, neighbors will do that, especially if you have good neighbors. Sometimes they don't, but in many cases they will. Especially if you can, I'm always willing to meet with the neighbor, explain the results of the survey. If the neighbor understands I'm not being one-sided and they trust me, then I can convince them a lot of times they will move the fence. The third thing you can do is you can work with the attorney to grant a license to the neighbor to keep the fence in place until the property is sold. And that's really important. You want the fence to move upon the sale because you don't want to end up with new neighbors that don't realize the fence is in the wrong spot. It causes major problems. So you tell your neighbor, you can keep the fence where it's at until you transfer or sell the property. Then you have to move the fence. And usually that works because if the property's being sold, there's usually some money changing hands, and that the cost to move the fence can be paid for out of that money. The fourth option is you move the fence, you move the property line to the fence with a lot line adjustment. Okay, and that's often a popular option, and I've worked on a number of surveys where we've done that. There is a cost to that. It costs money to have the surveyor prepare the lot line adjustment, and then there's fees to pay at the county or the city. But that's often a solution that works for folks is, everybody's kind of happy with where the fence is at. So you're just going to move the boundary line to the fence. There can be some issues you run into if that's going to cause problems with the building setback being violated, or there's other things, you move the line and you violate the minimum lot acreage. So there can be lane planning issues that potentially prevent that, but you can, not always, and sometimes you can plead a hardship case with the agency and get them to give you a variance on the land planning requirements. So those are your 4 options. I'm going to go through them again. Leave the fence in place and do nothing. Not a good idea. 2, ask for the fence to be moved or move your fence. 3, grant a license for the fence, but ask that it be moved before a sale or transfer. And 4, move the property line to the fence with a lot line adjustment. Here's what I don't want you to do under any circumstances. Do not chop down your neighbor's trees or bulldoze down his fence. That is a good way to get sued and end up in court. As I mentioned, there could be unwritten rights. Don't do anything with that fence until there's an agreement between you and your neighbor, preferably an agreement in writing. Okay, so fence encroachments happen, especially in rural areas. They happen a lot. There are ways to fix them. Get help from a surveyor. If your surveyor recommends it, get help from a good land attorney. Get that stuff cleaned up before you go to sell or before unwritten rights develop.